Hello and welcome. We're excited to have you join us today for today's webinar entitled AVM Testing Methodologies. The conversation continues. We'll get started with some quick introductions and a look at what's ahead. To get started, my name is David Rasmussen. I'm the Executive Vice President of Operations at Veros. I've been with Veros for 23 years now, and before that, another AVM company. So I've been hands-on in AVMs and AVM data and AVM testing and AVM research papers for multiple decades now. So I'm excited to be here and excited to hear from our speakers who will now introduce themselves. We'll start with Matt.
Thank you, David. My name is Matt Custer. I'm Vice President and AVM Program Manager for US Bank. I have over 20 years in the lending industry, all of which has been in the valuation or credit risk space. I'm also a certified residential appraiser with over 20 years of experience in the appraisal industry, as well as 10 years as a pre-licensing educational instructor. Appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the discussion today, and we'll now pass it over to Craig.
Craig, you're on mute.
Right off the bat. I'm the director of, my name is Craig Zelazny. I am the director of Optival and Valuation Analytics at Cotality. I've been involved with AVM since 2004, and I've been involved in multiple roles. I've worked for AVM developers, I've worked for lenders, I've done independent testing now for a number of years, and I've been in banking for 26 years total.
And
Eric.
My name is Eric Fox. I'm the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of Analytics team here at Veros Real Estate Solutions. I've been here for 24 years. I lead the modeling team, which develops the AVM Vero value. My background is in both mathematics, statistics, and economics, and I look forward to the discussion today.
And my name is Reena Agrawal, and I'm a senior research economist at Veros. I've been here for about 4 years now, where I focus on all things housing and economic research. Before that, I spent several years working in economic research and quantitative analysis.
Okay, well, thank you for those introductions. We'll continue on. So to give a little brief start here, Veros released or published our research paper on AVM testing a few months back. And since then, there's been quite a bit of buzz about the paper and about the testing, which has been great. We've got a lot of positive feedback, a lot of input. And so what we want to do today is continue the conversation. So today we'll hear not only from Veros, but from an independent lender with Matt, and then also an independent AVM tester in Craig. And so what we're really looking forward to is the conversation today and hearing their thoughts on the real world experiences and how they apply these AVMs and these AVMs testing in their day-to-day practice. So with that, a big thanks for everybody for joining, and let's get started.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dave. So we'll start out by talking a little bit about benchmarks for AVM testing. Now, one thing that we are of the opinion that AVM test performance and testing should be evaluated to align with the real world use case for the AVM. So accurate testing requires aligning the benchmarks to the use cases. So for example, AVMs that are being used to support purchase transactions should be tested using sales price benchmarks. AVMs that are being used to support refinance or HELOC transactions should be tested using appraisal benchmarks. But as our paper summarized and as some organizations are advocating, some proposed testing scenarios, such as pre-MLS list price testing, are using sales price benchmarks along with sometimes very dated AVM values prior to the MLS list price to test a refinance or HELOC use case scenario. And, you know, to be real honest with you, that's kind of perplexing to me. So we want to discuss what approaches that work for you as both a lender and an AVM tester. So maybe Craig, I'll tee up the first question here to you. Do you find that clients care about one or the other benchmark from a testing perspective?
You're on mute again.
Eric, absolutely they do. They may not recognize the importance of different benchmark types right away. But once we start to discuss the nuances and the relative merits of the different types of benchmarks, they gain an appreciation for the importance of looking at the AVM performance across different benchmark values. So as you're mentioning, when you've got, let's say, a purchase transaction, you've got a sale price, that gives you one type of insight into the AVM's ability to predict value. But if you're looking at a home equity loan where there is no purchase, there's no sale price, there's no list price, you're simply doing say a refinance, or you're doing a home equity loan where there may be an appraisal at some point in time, understanding how the AVM performs against that is really important. So back to the idea of the use case being really key to understanding the right way to look at this is fundamental. And as I've worked with lenders over the last 10 years, and benchmark availability has improved. Not too long ago, it was tough to get anything other than sale prices, and that was fine. But you've got an aging issue with sale prices. Once they make it to close and they've recorded and they get back into the public record, they're oftentimes available to the test organizations. We're in a position, my organization, to use benchmark values that are not yet in the public record, and they take several forms. They take the form of a contract price, which is a great proxy for sale price, and appraised value, full appraised values. So we can look at AVM performance across those different dimensions and understand how the AVM performs relative to that benchmark and subsequently to the use case itself. So yeah, lenders do, once they understand the nuances of this and the implications of understanding the information be conveyed by different benchmark types, they absolutely appreciate it, and they want to understand in more detail how those things differ.
Okay, well, very interesting, Craig. One of the things that you mentioned to me a while back, I don't even know if you remember, but you had made some comment about the differences between the average error between an appraisal and a sales benchmark, since you do both. Could you give us some insights on that?
Sure. I've done this a couple times over the last 20 years. The first time was back in 2004 when I was at National City Mortgage, and we were looking at performance across different metrics. And in a purchase transaction, we found that the appraised value tended to be somewhere between 0% different from the contract price and 1 to 2% above the contract price. There were occurrences where it was below, but those were certainly the exceptions. And I think that what that tells us is, as the appraiser is looking to pull together justification for the purchase, they're wanting to make certain that there is coverage for the borrowed amount and for the sale price, the contract price, but not padding it with too much additional equity to put additional risk in the loan. Now, along the same lines, I've also looked at contract prices versus sale prices. And it's interesting that a contract price turns out to be a really good proxy for a sale price. On average, the difference between the two is about 0.1%. So rarely do we see sale prices varying from the contract price by very much. And if they do, if they vary, it's very, very small. So we're finding, again, some relationships in the data, in the benchmark values that we can use to understand the overall performance and recognize that this relationship that exists between, let's say in this case, contract price, sale price, and appraised value. And it's all very consistent, which gives us a great platform for understanding the performance of the AVMs.
Well, that's all very insightful, Craig. One of the questions, Matt, for you, I was wanting to know, what do you use as a lender?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So based on my experience, it's important to use a combination of approaches. Excuse me. Purchase transaction data has historically been most commonly used for testing, primarily because the data is readily available and it's easily accessible to most. However, this approach alone does not ensure that we're seeing the true performance of an AVM. So as a result, I feel it's necessary to perform additional testing, or a combination of testing, to help identify AVMs that overweight or over leverage a particular variable, like the list price. This is why I prefer to include the refinance appraisal values in my testing. It assures me that it's most unlikely that the AVM has access to this benchmark. It also mimics our real world use case or real world use of AVMs. And it also helps me identify AVMs that are overweighting the list price and the valuation process. And in doing this, I can quickly weed out AVMs that are not going to perform as expected, or maybe not perform consistently once they reach the production environment.
So do you have any additional insights based on the interagency guidelines?
Yeah, the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines do a great job of outlining the appropriate use for different valuation products. And while they address a variety of products, only 2 are eligible for originations or extensions of credit. Appraisals are the most comprehensive, but they're also the costliest and the most time consuming. Appraisals are also the only valuation product eligible for all residential properties, regardless of transaction value or complexity. In contrast, the evaluation, which can be developed by an individual or more commonly developed using an AVM, it's limited to a maximum transaction value of $400,000. And lenders are required to assess the complexity of a property and a transaction to determine if an evaluation is appropriate for a specific transaction. So when you think about these differences, it's clear the appraisal is the gold standard, for lack of better terms. And it stands to reason that if a lender is going to use an alternative valuation product like an evaluation, the results of that product should be similar to what you would have expected to have seen had you received an appraisal.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Dave, I'll ask you a question from the perspective of an AVM vendor. So when you actually are tested as an AVM vendor, what kinds of practices do you typically see?
So Eric, I think the most important thing is the communication. So the communication between the AVM user, the tester, the testing agent, if that's a third party, and the AVM vendor themselves, a company like Veros, right? So we need to understand what's being tested, why it's being tested, understand the appropriate benchmarks that are being used, to make sure they, just as Craig and Matt just identified, that they replicate the production use of that valuation approach, right? So if you're going to use an AVM, you want to make sure it's tests the way it'll be used in production. And so that's important. So there's always, at least from a Veros perspective, a consultative approach in this testing. It's not just to send something over the fence and we value it and send it back. We really do practice what we preach. So we want to understand what the testing is for and what the use case is, so we can make sure and catch something up front if maybe the test is starting off on the wrong track, and which would take the results in another direction, right? So we want to identify that up front. And if we do see something, we flag that, and we have open communication with the testing or the tester to make sure that what they're testing for is ultimately what they're going to get on the back end as well. The other thing that is important, and it seems common sense, but over the years, I've seen a number of different tests, mostly good tests, and there's some not so great tests. But an important item is remember that the AVMs need to be tested on an apples to apples comparison. So we've seen some tests that have come over with different samples, different benchmarks, different approaches, and it's to be used in a comparison with one AVM against another, against their current production valuation approach, right? So we need to understand what the test is, and then make sure that all the AVMs being tested are on the same level playing field. And so the results that come out, again, on the back end are meaningful because they're apples to apples. And then as the results are available, it's always nice from a vendor standpoint because we enter these AVM tests and run them for free because it benefits the AVM provider in many different ways. But one of the ways it helps us is we hopefully get a blind view of the performance and where our AVM aligns with the other quality AVMs in the industry. And with that, we can identify where we're strong, where we're weak, where we need to spend more time and improve, and those types of things. So again, the biggest emphasis here is definitely the communication between the AVM providers and the tester, the lender tester, the third-party tester, whoever that is. And then what we found is with consistent testing, month after month, quarter after quarter, year after year, the lender will have confidence in the consistency of the AVM. And then that test cycle is a win-win-win for everybody. And so as we do that, we can identify the performance of the AVMs, where they can and should be used, and where they shouldn't be used. Again, and all this is in a real world, apples to apples comparison in the use cases identified by that lender.
So going back to the topic of testing benchmarks, when it comes to purchase benchmarks, there's been quite a bit of discussion around whether AVM should be using listing data. And MLS listings are more than just list price. And we also know that data from public records can often miss accurate information, for example, on living area or the number of bedrooms and baths. And so MLS listings fill this gap with more accurate and latest data. And also with new technology, Veros included, AVM modelers are looking at property photos to determine condition. So given this context, if we evaluate AVMs based on estimates before a property is listed, then AVM models are denied all this other information that comes with listing. And I would like to ask you, Matt, what is your opinion on an AVM's access to this listing information?
Yeah, thanks, Rena. Well, I think access to this additional information is critical in continually improving the performance of AVMs. As Craig mentioned earlier, public records tend to have a lag, and as you just mentioned, oftentimes they include inaccurate data, and in most cases, just the bare minimum when it comes to the data that they provide. So I think the inclusion of additional data found through the MLS listing definitely assists developers in determining which variables are most beneficial or most impactful in establishing credible value estimates, and quite frankly, which are not. Furthermore, variables like condition and quality of construction, which can be determined through both the listing descriptions and image analytics of photos, have the potential to give us as lenders the ability to possibly expand our use of AVMs beyond our current use. In today's environment, AVMs are used under sort of a general assumption that a property condition is average or typical in comparison to neighboring properties. So as access to more data improves, we can start to consider whether or not we could expand our use and perhaps be able to use them when we've got a better idea of what the true condition of a property is. All of that to say, I think the information is very important, not only for the accuracy of the subject property, but the MLS descriptions of the sales within the immediate market area surrounding a subject.
So I have a related question for you, Craig. Can you determine whether an AVM estimate is being influenced by list prices versus all the other listing information? What I mean is, can a tester separate out the two effects and say for sure that an AVM estimate changed in response to list prices?
No, I don't believe so. And I don't think you should try. As Matt was saying, all this information is valuable. In my mind, it's ideal for the AVM to have all the information that was available as recently as yesterday, whether that be a list price, whether it be characteristic information, whether it be whatever's out there. Models get better when they have more information. And we have to make the assumption, and it's a good, fair assumption, that all the AVMs are striving to be the most accurate predictors of value. Now, ultimately, when we do tests, whether Matt does it himself, whether we're doing it as an independent third party, what we're looking at is how well did the AVM predict the value of that subject property compared to some known value. And if that known value is a full 1004 appraisal, which everyone says is the gold standard, that's a good solid number, or it is a contract price, which is an excellent proxy for sale price. What we're comparing it to is the end result. And at the end of the day, if the AVM is doing a good job of predicting that value relative to a known benchmark value, then the AVM is performing well. If they've got list price information, if they have listing characteristic information, that's simply helping to improve the predicted value. Now, is there a way to separate that out? No, I don't think there is. I mean, if you dig down deep and you start following listings and start trying to pull stuff out, but then to what David was mentioning earlier, you create this unfair situation where I'm now taking what falls out naturally and I'm manipulating it to try to create a situation which I don't know is true. I think the best way to approach testing is you let the models have the data they can get a hold of, let them build the best model they can, you use the best benchmark for the situation you're addressing, and you let the chips fall where they may. And then you start to look for those kind of weird situations that may, in the aggregate, have a negative impact on the accuracy of the predicted values. There's something there that's skewing the data one way or the other. But ultimately, there's no way that I know of to go in and pull that information out and start to filter for what may be a list price or a listing characteristic information, and then somehow make adjustments for that. Again, I think you let the data speak for itself and you take it as it's presented to you.
So given that the primary use case for AVMs is HELOCs and refis, and we have the ability to blindly test AVMs against appraisal benchmarks, then why is there all the fuss with list prices? I mean, because there are some who are out there advocating that AVMs should be denied all this listing information. Matt, do you have an opinion on this?
I do, Rena, and I appreciate the question. I have opinion on a lot of things, but two arguments immediately come to mind. And first, and probably the most common, is that the appraisal process is not perfect science. And that leads some to speculate that using appraisal values may result in potentially inaccurate benchmark values. And I guess what I mean by that is that if you have several different appraisers appraise the same property, you'll likely get different values from each. Sometimes those values will be tightly grouped, and other cases, the range between the three values or multiple values may be fairly significant. So I think some would argue that there's some ambiguity about the accuracy of these benchmarks. But this argument also ignores the fact that just because buyers and sellers agree on a price doesn't necessarily mean that that price represents the most probable value or most probable sale price of the property. So while we know, as Craig pointed out earlier, that the purchase transactions have a tendency to show appraisal values that are very, very close to the contract price, I think most of us can kind of think back just a little bit during COVID, where we saw rapid appreciation of properties in many areas. It was nearly impossible to buy a home at its original list price. Properties had multiple bids, and ultimately the sellers would choose the one that obviously was most favorable to them. And in these cases, this is not a representation of the most probable value or most probable price, but rather it's a reflection of the highest price that somebody can get on a particular property. And I think the second reason for a lot of the fuss is the access to refinance appraisal data. And Craig indicated that while that data may be becoming a little more available, it is relatively limited, and usually limited to the lenders that are originating the refinance transactions and vendor partners that those lenders work with that manage technology platforms or loan origination systems. Where those benchmark or where those refinance appraised values are being shared. So I think those are the two reasons from my perspective that we're hearing a lot of the noise around the use of appraisal benchmarks and the potential or proposed restriction of certain listing data.
Thank you, Matt, for that.
All right, so let's dive in a little bit more to concerns with pre-MLS listing testing. Matt, based on some of the things you just said, could you talk a little bit more about why pre-MLS list price testing is concerning to you and potentially a misleading way to test an AVM?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to what David said at the very beginning. We're always wanting to ensure that we're doing an apples to apples comparison. So when we're obtaining a value on a property, we're looking at or looking for an estimate of value at a specific point in time. Therefore, if we're using a benchmark that's from a different time compared to the date of the AVM value, there's the potential for important data to be missed or not considered. And while I recognize the importance of testing an AVM's performance prior to it having any insight or any hint of a future value, reverting to an AVM value that predates the listing of a property, it also has the potential to exclude other pertinent market data that would have legitimately led to adjustments in the AVM value over the period of time between when the property was originally listed and when it went under contract. And ultimately, in my experience, that sort of takes away from that apples to apples comparison and raises a concern for me.
Okay. And I mean, we've seen similar things with this pre-MLS list price testing compared to a typical use case. I mean, for example, we've seen P10s that are 10 to 15% lower with the pre-MLS list price testing just compared to how it would normally perform in production. And so one question we always ask is, have you suddenly elevated AVMs that don't update their data as frequently? Maybe they update their data every other week or every month, compared to those AVMs who update their data nightly, as an example. And I kind of think about a silly story as an analogy, but of a track race perhaps. And some may argue that some of the racers may have an advantage over others because they're wearing very expensive tennis shoes, but others are maybe wearing more basic shoes. So if somebody, say, were to propose for the track race, well, we need to even that playing field here by requiring all the runners run barefoot. Well, you could certainly do that, I suppose, but you've got something now that isn't a use case that resembles anything. So our use case now suddenly has become a barefoot race. And the big assumption here is hopefully the ranking of the winner of this barefoot race and who comes in number 2 and who comes in number 3 is going to be preserved versus a normal race where everybody wears their track shoes. Well, that's a huge supposition that that's going to occur. And I think we feel that the same thing is true with this pre-MLS list price testing. Hopefully, the best AVM is still going to be the quote unquote winner of the pre-MLS list price testing race. And that's, again, not assured. So in the real world also, these racers are either going to have, they're going to have the shoes they have, what shoes they can afford, what shoes are their favorites. And so you can test an AVM without MLS data, but there's always going to be MLS data that most AVMs use. So you're going to be testing in a situation that is fictitious. And the result of this barefoot race is the racer times are going to be slower. And so similarly, AVMs are going to have lower accuracy with this restricted data. So Craig, a question to you. What are some other strategies that might be available to test for AVMs with a high dependence on list price?
Eric, I believe that the most important characteristic of a good test, or certainly one of the most important, is the recency of the benchmark data. Now, there are a couple of ideas behind that. One is as data makes its way into the public record and through the data aggregators and then back to the AVM developers, they're going to have insight into the very transactions that we're testing, which is not a fair test. When we do testing, we only use benchmark data or transactions which are no more than 7 days old. And that's to prevent and virtually eliminate the possibility that these loans have gone to closing, they've been recorded and made their way back. So they're completely blind to the AVM vendors. That's number one, is looking at the recency of your benchmark data. And it's not always easy to do. And that's why sometimes you look to a third party for help. Certainly lenders can be in a position to do some testing that's unique from that perspective. A lot of the larger lenders who are doing home equity lending have a first mortgage production pipeline from which they can draw to test. So they can use those first mortgage transactions. They can submit them for AVM estimates as part of the origination process and get a valuation to do evaluation of the AVM's performance right there in the middle, right before it goes to closing. And that's a really good thing. But beyond that, you want to look for multiple sources of data, as we've discussed. So contract price, sale price, appraisal data, whatever it might be as a benchmark. And two, I think the best way to do this is to keep everything as fresh as possible. I mentioned earlier that I think it's great that an AVM, if they've got data that's even 24 hours old, it's that current, that's really good because that's really a real world situation. When I run an AVM in production next Tuesday, the AVM is going to return to me whatever they've got available. And that's what I want to try to test. But doing that test needs to be within the confines of, I'm not letting this data leak out and become knowledge to everybody. I want to keep it as current and recent as possible. I think that's the key to this whole thing.
So we have been discussing the importance of testing in the context of AVM use case and that AVM test performance should be evaluated to align with real world use cases. This question is to you, Craig. What are some of the key aspects of testing to ensure that results in testing match use case performance?
As we've discussed, Rena, I think the most important one is matching your benchmark to your use case. The recency of your benchmark. So let's make certain that we're doing testing frequently and we're using benchmarks that are not too old. As I said, our benchmarks are no more than 7 days old when they're submitted to the vendors for their predicted values. Beyond that, testing frequency. So here's the other thing that you sometimes see. Lenders will say, oh, I only want to update my test results every 6 months or every year. And you can test for 12 months. At the end of 12 months, what you tested 10 months ago probably has very little benefit to what you're looking at. We want to be as current in the moment as possible. The housing market may or may not be incredibly volatile at a given point in time. But we have seen, as Matt pointed out earlier, situations like COVID, where home prices changed dramatically. The supply and demand function was not normal. So by testing every week, by updating your results, and if you're using a cascade or you're choosing a set of AVMs to use, do that right on the heels of the end of your test cycle. So we test, as an example, every week, 50 times a year. And then at the end of a given quarter, we do an update based on that most recent data. We're not waiting 6 or 8 weeks after the end of the test cycle and then updating the selected AVMs. Keeping everything very, very tight in terms of time and recency is really fundamental to getting a good test process and the results that you use reflecting the most current and applicable situation, right, and characteristics of the moment. The timing is right, the market's the same. We're not putting this big lag between what we studied and what we think is happening and what we're actually doing in production.
So Matt, you mentioned pre-MLS listing testing is concerning. What are some other ways that we can test without using an approach riddled with such multiple concerns?
Great question, Rena. And I think Craig kind of touched on this a little bit. I think it's important to consider using the combination of sale price data and refinance appraisal values as benchmarks. These two approaches could be combined into a single testing strategy or separated into 2 independent tests to help the tester identify performance under different scenarios. If you're using them as 2 independent tests, I would recommend leveraging sales prices first. This gives you a solid understanding of how AVMs perform against other AVMs or their peer AVMs. And after gaining an understanding of this performance, a second test can be done using refinance appraisals. And as I mentioned earlier, this helps assist in identifying those AVMs that over leverage or excessively weight the list price and are unlikely to perform as you would expect them to for their given use case. So I recognize the appraisal process is not perfect, and as a result, AVM users should be aware that they're likely to see minor differences in performance between these 2 benchmark use cases. However, if you use adequate sample sizes, I think ultimately what that leads to is a good view or a clear picture of how the AVMs will perform once they're deployed into production.
All right, so we'll conclude the webinar today. Big thanks to our speakers and all who presented in today's discussion. It was a great discussion. There's a lot of interesting comments and some very important testing points to take into consideration. So a quick summary of some of the important things and emphasis for this webinar today is real world use cases require real world testing. So the use of benchmark data that matches the intended lending scenario is critical. Testing the right data avoids distorted results and ensures production reliability. So real world use cases, real world testing. Another point is AVM testing helps manage risk and supports informed decisions across the board. Good testing provides lenders and modelers insight into actual performance. It therefore reduces any surprises and supports more confident, data-driven adoption. And then another final point is collaboration is key. No one entity has all the answers. And so what we're trying to do with, what Veros is trying to do with the paper and with today's webinar, joining with lenders and testers and other AVM providers to consult and identify what are the best practices, what are those standards that we should all be addressing and living up to. And one big plug here I'd like to just simply insert is the MISMO AVM work group. So This is a MISMO work group, just of AVM providers, AVM modelers, lenders, AVM testing entities that come together and talk about the best practices and how to apply them, and what is the appropriate use case, and what papers need to be written to support and further educate the industry on AVMs and their proper application, right? So there's a lot of discussion that does take place in a consistent manner. There's recent papers that have been released by this MISMO work group, and there's more to come as well. So we invite you to join us in MISMO. We invite you to join us at different conferences. The presenters here today will be at different conferences like the MBA annual that's upcoming. We have additional webinars coming up. We have additional papers being released. But let's continue the conversation. This isn't a debate. This isn't a my way is the right way and your way is the wrong way. This is an open conversation. Let's talk about it. Let's figure out what are the best practices and then apply those. So with that, I'll conclude. We thank you so much for attending and have a nice day.
Thank you all for this great discussion.